Mr. Chair. How are you doing today? Am I allowed to ask questions directly to you? I think I am. Or do I
Order,
do it to
please.
you again? Okay.
Please direct all questions through the chair. Thank you.
Thanks. I wasn't quite sure about that in this room. I'm to gather that above the additional 11.5 million provided to the NSBI, in total, NSBI will receive close to 40 million from the government this year. So my first question is, what requirements are given to NSBI from the province to assure accountability of these funds that go out to the various businesses?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I thank my colleague for the question and acknowledge her gesture earlier, and I too will go through the chair. Just a couple of points I'll make, and they're captured in the business plan for my colleague's reference on page 50, the outcomes and performance measures, page 51 and 52. There's three areas where that focus really of accountability would be: trade, investment, and payroll, and Nova Scotia's business climate. And one of the components that we've introduced for the first time in government in Nova Scotia is outcome agreements and alignment agreements, outcome agreements with the Crown Corporation. So another lens of accountability to ensure that the Crown Corporation, whether it's NSBI or any one of the others, Mr. Chair, that they're aligning the work they do with the priorities of government. And it really is about ensuring the work that we all do across government is focused on the priorities, and that outcome agreement with Crown Corporations is one of the tools that I believe will be the most significant in ensuring that the work being done is focused on the priorities with an inherent level of accountability built into that. So in a general way, with regards to the $40 million that my colleague has referenced, that would be the policy oversight. My colleague may have questions that are more specific to components within NSBI that I may be able to expand on and answer, Mr. Chair.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you. And the Minister referenced a few of the operations that are receiving funding, and I do remember that there are a number of banks that are receiving some funding for their wage salary, for their looking after their workers. One of them is the Royal Bank, one of them is the TD, and the other one is Butterfield Bank, I believe it's called. Butterfield? It's an offshore bank. And I'm just wondering, what is the reasoning behind giving those particular banks funding from the Department of the NSBI?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. In general terms, the purpose of the payroll rebate is to provide incentives in the form of rebate for eligible payroll for new jobs. So my colleague has referenced in particular 3 financial institutions. And I just want to take a moment to really explain what the payroll rebate is intended to do and how it's managed. And I think there has been some confusion, Mr. Chair, into the actual responsibility of the payroll rebate itself. The rebate is not paid out, Mr. Chair, until the company itself demonstrates that it has actually created new jobs. And of course, this is administered through NSBI. They actually provide the incentive. And it's up to the company to create those jobs before they earn the incentive. And in very basic terms, in this case, the financial sector, the monies identified for payroll rebates in the jobs that they create, bearing in mind that no money is paid out until the job is created and there's an audit process to confirm those numbers. Only then is the money expended. And in every case, with payroll rebates based on the percentage of return, the 5 to 10% that we've talked about on Tuesday with my colleagues, in-house leader, the tax revenue generated from the jobs created always exceeds the amount expended through payroll rebates. What it also does, Mr. Chair, is it identifies a focus on not only job creation, so investment attraction, job creation, but job retention. And the average numbers that I'm hearing, Mr. Chair, just in HRM, the average employment growth in HRM is earmarked around 6%. The employment growth in the financial services sector, so this would include those recipients of payroll rebates, the 3 financial institutions that my colleague has referenced, is in the area of 24%. So we're seeing that the payroll rebates are financially sound. They identify a 5 to 10% component, and they are creating jobs, and they are creating jobs well above the average here in HRM, where we are being identified, HRM is being identified really as a financial services sector that is becoming quite significant. So the payroll rebates, in very general terms, are supporting those objectives.
The Honourable Member for Truro, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker, and I thank the Minister for that explanation. I'm curious, though, so why would a Royal Bank, which is one of the highest grossing banks in Canada, need our incentive to be able to create these jobs when it seems like government is questioning other industries about incentives and about payroll rebates, when really the RBC is doing so well, and so is TD. And I'm also very curious as to why we would be funding a bank that's in Bermuda. So that's a couple of questions there. Thank you.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I can't speak for the financial institution, but I think what I can identify as reasons why anyone in the financial sector may look at Nova Scotia. I think in general terms they would pick locations where they're able to establish or continue their business or expand. And for them to compete successfully, they obviously look at factors such as our skilled labor from our academic communities, both the university and community college areas, supplies, transportation, or communication linkages. But I think it's important not only for my colleague, Mr. Chair, and the question that she's advanced, but I think for everyone in this legislature to understand payroll rebates are not solely for financial institutions. And I think one of the best examples of that really is Oxford Frozen Foods in Oxford, Cumberland County, who represent the best choice of location to be competitive. They chose that area, Oxford, as the best location for them to be competitive on the world stage. And they have applied for and they've been successful in payroll rebates. So I know my colleague is focused on the financial institutions, but payroll rebates are available to other sectors of our economy, and we're seeing others access those monies to create jobs, to advance economic growth, and to see rural Nova Scotia be successful as well.
The honourable member for Churl, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And yes, while I appreciate his response about places around rural Nova Scotia, again, I didn't really hear an answer to my question about why very, very successful banking corporations would be needing incentives such as this in order to create jobs in Nova Scotia. And also, I'm extremely interested in why we are providing payroll rebate to a bank, an offshore bank in Bermuda.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. Two-part question, and I apologize. It was not my intent to avoid the answer. I think the first part of it as to why would a government through a payroll rebate support a successful financial institution. That's part of the competitive world that we live in. All provinces and states throughout the U.S. Are offering incentives to incent industry, in this case financial institutions, to their communities. And it is because of the jobs that they create, so the investment attraction, the job creation, the job retention, and the high retention of those jobs, as I indicated earlier in the employment growth, the numbers that are referenced in this sector. My colleague has spoke about Butterfield as an offshore bank. Butterfield, any financial institution, to qualify for payroll rebates have to have a Nova Scotia presence. They have to have a Nova Scotia footprint, and Butterfield has that. If it were not for their presence in Halifax, they would not qualify for the payroll rebate. So they are certainly a much larger financial institution, but they do have a Halifax presence.
The Honourable Member for Churl, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. A couple of things. One is, in hearing the minister talk about these rebates for these businesses and to create incentive to create jobs and keep jobs here and to be competitive, well, that sounds exactly like what the film tax credit was designed for, and why, in fact, we did have that here in Nova Scotia. And I would suggest that I would like to ask, I mean, do these three banks provide 3,200 jobs or 1,600 full-time jobs?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate the question from my colleague. I do want to speak to the numbers that my colleague is using, and I know those are the numbers that the film industry is presenting and advancing in many discussions. And I think what's important to recognize is government and the industry still differ on what those numbers are. So I'm not so focused on the numbers, Mr. Chair, as the Minister of Business. I'm focused on multiple sectors and how we can grow a variety of sectors to ensure that the numbers that my colleague refers to are numbers that we're able to achieve and exceed across multiple sectors. That's our objective in growing the economy of Nova Scotia. But I think for my colleague's benefit, I do want to identify the difference between the film tax credit and payroll rebates, and I think that would be valuable for many who are listening. They're similar in that both function like grants based on amounts that are paid for labor. And I've said this before, and I think we have to deal with the very facts. The former funding formula that preceded the Film Television Production Incentive Fund was a labor subsidy between 50 and 65%. Now, I know there are individuals who take exception to the number 65, and it wasn't every production that would experience 65% labor subsidy. Depending on where they filmed and for how long they filmed, there were incentives that would take them above and beyond 50 and could creep into 65. The payroll rebate, as I indicated earlier, is a 5 to 10% component that usually averages somewhere in the area of 8%. So, as I said to the Leader of the Official Opposition on Tuesday, very distinct difference between a 50 and 65% labor subsidy and an 8% incentive. That's important. The payroll rebate is based on a percentage of eligible payroll for new jobs, and the rate is set to be less than the expected provincial taxes. So I explained this in very general terms earlier. And they're paid by the new employees somewhere between the 5 and 10% mark. There is an overall budget allotment which we can plan to when we publicly release that agreement with the company and the regular updates on our accountability website. We expect employment to continue after the payroll rebate is finished. And that's what we're seeing, Mr. Chair, with the numbers I referenced earlier. The former tax credit, as I've referenced, was paid based on a percentage of allowable labor expenses ranging between the 50 and 65% area, which is above the expected provincial taxes paid by people covered by the tax credit. The qualifying labor portion included such things as the labor part of meals and accommodations. Because the tax credit was project-based, it was not expected that most of the employment would continue unless there was another project with another tax credit. Publicly, only a total amount of the tax credit could be released. Since it was managed through the tax system, it made planning difficult as there was no overall budget. So what we've done, Mr. Speaker, responsible for Nova Scotia taxpayer dollars, Mr. Chair, I'm sorry, in continuing to support the film industry was to establish the Film Television Production Incentive Fund that continues with a 25 to 32% all spend. And there's various components in that where we would see the return vary. So 25% is the base for a production in Nova Scotia. If it's outside of HRM, there's an incentive. If it's beyond 30 days, there's an incentive. A number of components that would allow a producer to attain the 32% level. So I hope that's a little helpful in responding to my colleagues' questions. What I would like to do, Mr. Chair, if it's appropriate, if I could ask one of our very pleasant pages to copy this document, and I would like to provide a copy to my colleague. It basically outlines a payroll rebate fact sheet that I think may be helpful.
Could I ask the Honourable Minister to table the document?
Yes.
And then copies can be made. The Honourable Member for Churl, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you very much, and I thank the Minister for that, the table that he's going to be tabling, and he's going to be giving me a copy. I appreciate that. I'm still very interested about the Butterfield Bank, and I'm wondering if the minister is aware that that particular bank has apparently been involved in some scandal in the past. So the Panama Papers is something that has come to my attention, and I'm just wondering if he's aware of anything like that.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The name of the financial institution certainly has a history that preceded our government, and I even believe the previous government. There's been a number of purchases and sales within that financial institution, and these were questions, in fairness to my colleague, that I posed as we were going through, the briefings on the payroll rebate for Butterfield. And the research that has been completed clearly demonstrates that the financial institution that we are speaking of today, Butterfield, is no way now, or have they ever been connected to the scandals that my colleague has referenced, Mr. Chair, in a period that preceded, I believe, both our governments.
The Honourable Member for Churchill, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Chair, and I appreciate that response. I'm also aware, and I'm wondering if the minister is at all aware or concerned, that the former executive director of NSBI actually worked at that Butterfield Bank many years ago. Then he actually came and took a job here and was executive director of NSBI and recommended payroll rebates to that company, I believe, while our government was in power. And now I see that he went back there again. I'm not sure where he is now, but so I'm wondering why we are continuing and how this whole, how did this happen? And does the minister have any concerns about the perhaps incestuousness of this relationship?
The Honourable Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. I don't know who the individual is that my colleague is referring to, but as I indicated earlier, when I was being briefed on the payroll rebate for this financial institution, I probed on the history of the connection to I think, a financial institution that had previously a payroll rebate in the province. And it was through that probing, through the work that NSBI did relative to this file and the feedback and evidence that they were able to present to me, that I'm completely satisfied with the integrity of this particular financial institution. I'm very confident in the work that NSBI did in securing the information that I requested relative to any connections, and allowed me to make an informed decision that this financial institution has high reputation, has integrity in the industry, and to my colleague's question, I have no concerns around this financial institution as a recipient for the payroll rebate through NSBI.
The Honourable Member for Churchill, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. And I'd be very curious as to know just how many jobs have actually been created by the funding to the payroll rebate to these three banks.
The Honourable Minister of Business.
My apologies, Mr. Chair. I was speaking to one of my colleagues. Could I ask my colleague to repeat the question? Thank you.
The Honourable Member for Churchill, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I was wondering how many jobs have actually been created by the payroll rebate funding to the three banks.
The Honourable Member, Minister of Business.
Thank you, Mr. Chair. The question that my colleague has posed, I don't have the specific numbers relative to those three financial institutions at this stage in that payroll rebate, but we can certainly attempt to gather that information from my colleague and share it with her. What I will say in general terms, with regards to the success of the payroll rebate program, from 2007 to 2012, Gardner Pinfold had completed an analysis on the economic impact of Nova Scotia Business Inc., and over the period of that review showed provincial support through NSBI helped to support the creation of at least 6,700 full-time equivalent jobs through the payroll rebate program. So it's demonstrated itself to be a very successful program. That's why we continue to invest in that investment attraction and the opportunity to create those jobs with a high rate of retention at very, very good pay scales, Mr. Chair. My colleague has just been able to determine that specific to the Royal Bank, they have created 150 jobs through the payroll rebate since over the last year, but we'll get those numbers for the other two financial institutions from my colleague.
The Honourable Member for Churl, Bible Hill, Millbrook, Salmon River.
Thank you, Mr. Speaker. Yes, I'd appreciate that. I'd like to know exactly how many jobs have actually been created by this. Also, I'd just like to note that in Hansard, November the 7th in 2012, I noticed that the Premier actually mentioned that he had mixed feelings about the need to use payroll rebates to attract employers here to Nova Scotia. And he said that the benefit of the tool is that companies actually have to create the jobs to receive the benefit, but it worried him at the time that the economy is so uncompetitive that we need to use these tools to bring employers here. And also he mentioned that these payroll rebates, he said, are being used to help an out-of-province company compete for or poach talent from Nova Scotia businesses. Businesses expect to have to compete with other companies for talent, but they shouldn't have to compete with the government-subsidized companies for talent. That's an unfair advantage, and that's the government picking winners and losers. And that is actually what was said in November 7th, 2012 by the Premier. So I'm wondering again why the NSBI is so focused on creating jobs in this fashion.
I'll request the Honourable Member to table the document with the quotation from the Premier, please. The Honourable Minister of Business.
I think, without being blunt, because I have the utmost respect for my colleague referenced earlier a number of 3,000 jobs that we agreed to disagree on. But quite clearly, the payroll rebate program between 2007 and 2012 created 6,700 jobs. The other component that is valuable for me, Mr. Chair, and I continue to use the phrase and the terminology around evidence-based decision-making, Tom Travis completed a very thorough report within the very recent past, I'm going to say the last 2 or 3, maybe 4 years, where he clearly identified the strength of the payroll rebate program. That was an independent review done to determine the strength of programs, in this case payroll rebate, and I value that